My name's Tony Garcia. I'm from Miami, Florida, and I'm an architect. One of the main parts of my business is actually bicycle planning. So this is my first time in Amsterdam, and I'm delighted to see the infrastructure that we have here. If you've ever been to Miami, you know that we are very challenged when it comes to anything that's out of your car. So one of my big focuses, not just as a professional, but as a member of the community, and what Martin said about being a professional and bringing our professional expertise to bear is very related to what I'm going to talk to you today about. How many of you are professionals in the urban planning field? You're either academics or, cool. What about government officials? Anybody from municipal? Just a couple. Okay, all right, that's okay, that's okay. So, we do a lot of different types of projects, but I spend a good 30 to 40% of my time, my quote-unquote billable time, on things that are not billable. They're nonprofit, passion-driven projects, and what you're going to see today about tactical urbanism is just something that my business partner and I, we were observing over the past 10 years, and we wanted to write about it and start talking about it, and now it's become something that more people talk about, and we actually use it in our professional practice. So, where am I pointing? Wah, wah. Maybe if I'm over here. You want to go to the next one? So most of my time I spent looking at streets like this, just a pretty dead space, and trying to introduce even the most basic urban infrastructure, walkability and more bikeability. Now, granted, this is not Amsterdam level bicycle infrastructure, but for St. Louis, where this is, it's a huge change. And you'll notice what we did there was take a turn lane. We're taking this public land that is usually used for cars and turning it into something for bikes. And this is the common response that we get. How can you do that? You're going to take away our travel lanes. It's going to take longer, 5 minutes longer for me to get to my destination. I'm not going to be able to drive 50 miles an hour. So in our practice, we're always wondering, how can we help convince this person, and not just this person, but the elected officials that they talk to, because in a lot of the cases where in the cities where we work, they're very active. People don't call their elected officials to say what a great job they're doing. They call their elected officials to tell them how terribly they're doing, right? How can you do this? How can you hire these crazy bicycle people to come and take away our travel lanes, right? So we're thinking, how do we create this culture shift? How can we help people understand that this is for their own benefit? And this might be totally foreign to everyone here because you're used to an infrastructure and a system of government where if you need bike lanes, you just do the bike lanes, right? In the United States, we have to undo 50 or 60 years of terrible planning, and it's a very tough sell. So for me, the aha moment came on a trip that I took with my son to Manhattan in 2008. It was just a father-son trip. We were just wandering around New York City, and I had been working by that time for 6 years as an architect in Miami, and it was the last building boom. We're in another building boom right now, if you didn't know that. If you go to Miami right now, it's full of cranes. People are still building there despite the whole discussion of sea level rise. There's a very big disconnect. But in that time, I had worked on several projects that were 12, 15, 20 stories, and all of a sudden, overnight, they just kind of disappeared. So I took this trip and I said, I don't know what I'm doing. I want to be an architect to affect change in the world, and I'm not doing that right now. All of my hard work for the past 5 years has just gone up in smoke. I had also been advocating in the community for many years for an expanded rail network in Miami, and we had a tax passed in 2002, and it was a great plan. And around this time also, our elected officials said, you know what, it's just too expensive. We're not going to do that. We're going to use the tax that you passed, and we're going to use it to pay for our existing bills and to buy new trains, but not to do any new routes. So you know, 5 years, 10 years of my time had just sort of vanished, and I didn't know what I was going to do, because I didn't want to be an architect just for the sake of calling myself an architect. I mean, it's not like we don't make that much money. I could have been a banker or a lawyer or something else, right? If it were about the money, because it's not about the money. So we were in Times Square, and we went to the toy store. There's a Toys R Us there, and this was happening that weekend. The Department of Transportation under Mayor Bloomberg had closed Times Square to cars. They bought thousands of these plastic lawn chairs, and if you see in the background those orange bollards, they just closed the street. And that to me it was an aha moment. It just hit me, and I said, this makes sense, of course, why not? This didn't need a study, some huge traffic study, which is normally what you need to do any sort of street change. And it was so immediate and real to me that we started studying more about this idea. Now, the whole concept to close Times Square to cars was not new. It had been studied since the 1960s, and the RPA had created a plan for Midtown Manhattan where they closed large portions, not just Broadway, but all around Manhattan, closed to cars, create urban greens and protected bikeways. Of course, this sat on a shelf for 50 years because there was no way to test it. There was no way to say, this is going to work or this is not going to work, right? Until they did this. And so the first step when we're studying this idea was just disrupt the status quo. And we take a lot from the hacker culture, the idea. It's not just about the technology, as Martin was saying. It's about the whole philosophy behind it. Disruption is part of the modern world. We should be disrupting everything that we do because that will get us to a better result. And so without this disruption, this plan would never go anywhere, right? So just doing this changed people's notion about what was possible as a change in perception of, oh, of course you can close Times Square. The week before, even I would have said, that's crazy. Why would you do that? That's just going to cause more traffic. In fact, it didn't cause more traffic. What it did was increase retail rents for the surrounding area, and it also improved safety for bicyclists, pedestrians, and motorists. Of course, the biggest opponent to this whole plan was the Business Improvement District, and once they started testing things out and actually gathering data, they realized, wait a second, this is amazing. Now they're the biggest champions of the Times Square renovation. But the idea is that you iterate, right? This is not the final design, right? This is just the initial disruption. It's planting a flag in the ground saying, we're going to do this. Then maybe a year later, you invest in a little bit more permanent materials, slightly more expensive. Not very expensive, just let's paint the asphalt so it doesn't look like that. And let's buy a little bit better lawn furniture that didn't come from Walmart or wherever. And that's what they did. So all this time, they're able to test out the idea, right? This doesn't work, this works. They're figuring things out until the point where they can get to a design that is, going to be tens of millions of dollars and is more permanent. Obviously, this is a higher level of investment than what you see here. To the point where that's what's actually happened. There you go. And there's the final design. I mean, you don't need a lot of bells and whistles for it. It works. But this, you would never have gotten here if you hadn't had started here. And that's the biggest point of tactical urbanism, is that you need to start with small, very small steps. This happened over the course of a weekend, okay? And limit your budget. So I'm going to return to this methodology. And this is actually something that we take from product design. All of these products that we use, everything that we use in the world today, goes through a product design where it's tested and there's an iteration of it and you change it around a little bit and you see how it works and you gather data. We don't do that for our cities. And we spend hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars arguably, on infrastructure that we're going to live with for the next 50, 60, 100 years, and yet we never test any of it. And it seems ridiculous to me in the way that we test our iPhone, and it gets better every time, right? Why don't we do that for our infrastructure? Obviously, there's other things at play here that make it more complicated, but we'll get into that. So build, measure, learn. That's the tagline. If you keep on remembering that. Build, measure, learn. It's like when we were in architecture school. You make a drawing, you show it to your professor. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work, right? Propose and dispose. 90% of the things that you propose are going to be garbage anyway, but that's how you get to that last 10%. That's brilliant. So we look at the word tactical because it has to do with small moves. And that's where the term tactical urbanism comes from. But really, I mean, you can call it whatever you want. It's just about getting making small moves towards some bigger purpose. When we started studying this idea across the United States and across the world, in fact, there were four main characteristics that differentiated it from other types of movements that are happening at the same time. And the first is that it's short-term, right? I mean, that's the very essence of tactical urbanism, is that it shouldn't take a long time, and it should be cheap, inexpensive, cut off zeros off of your budget. Jaime Lerner, who's a famous Brazilian urban planner and mayor of Curitiba, says, cut off zeros off of your budget. If you have $1 million budget, get down to a $1,000 budget, right? The most important part besides those two is that you use existing plans. This is not planning without any plans. This is dusting off all of those great plans that we create as urban planners and architects, and discover the plans that we have there, the ideas that are just waiting to be implemented. Because as with the RPA plan, we can make beautiful plans and beautiful drawings, but if there's not the implementation to back it up, it's never going to go anywhere. It's going to sit on a shelf. And that's what we don't want, right? We don't want to work for the next 50 years and have a body of great work sitting on a shelf that never actually was built, because that's not why we're here. That's not why we got into this business, was to actually impact the world that we live in, right? And finally, the creation of social capital, which gets back to what Martin was saying also. This is about citizens getting involved with making the cities that they inhabit. We shouldn't be the only ones that are designing these cities. Policymakers and urban planners are traditionally pretty bad at making great cities. It's normal people that make great cities. And so including them in the process not only makes a better product, but it also addresses the angry person in the first slide that I showed, the one that doesn't want you to take away his travel lanes. Because when you include them in your project, what you're doing is you're giving them ownership of it. And what happens when you're involved with something, you take pride in it and you support it, right? And that's one of the biggest ways to address what we call in the United States NIMBYism, not in my backyard. You could be selling anything. I mean, it could be a certain type of development. We could try to do 4-story townhouses in Miami, and people would get upset about it. That's development, that's no good, it's gonna bring traffic, and bringing the people who would otherwise be the opponents into the process makes them the best proponent of it, right? You go from something that's a reactive planning process to something that's proactive. And then those people are actually the ones that write their commissioners and their councilmen and their mayors. And instead of writing bad letters, they write nice ones. So that's the four main characteristics. And when we look at the typology, all the different ways that people can apply this type of thinking, you go from unsanctioned citizen guerrilla-style tactics that maybe border on, some of them definitely illegal, but they're not really leading up to any plan, to the more sanctioned projects that really require City Hall's buy-in, right? The closing Times Square, that wasn't going to happen because a group of us went out in Times Square in the middle of the night, right? The DOT really had to be involved and be there. But for example, there's something called weed bombing. Has anybody heard of weed bombing? Anyone? You've heard of weed bombing. Okay, so just a couple of developers in downtown Miami decided that the city wasn't doing enough to maintain parts of downtown where you had weeds coming out of the ground just in the sidewalk. So they went around with some spray paint and artfully painted the weeds so that it became a sort of public art project, and in the process also killed the weeds, because after a week the weeds just died. So there wasn't any plan that said, oh, go out and do weed bombing, right? But it's a cool thing that the citizens took it upon themselves to do what cities should be doing rightfully. And then there's this whole, in terms of who's doing what. There are the citizens, and then there's the mayor and the city council, but there's this in-between of entities, nonprofits, developers, that can play an integral role in facilitating this type of work. And so what's the difference between do-it-yourself urbanism and tactical urbanism? A lot of people ask me that. And the real difference is that one is directed towards a larger process, that is, it's part of some sort of a bigger vision, and the other is fun. Like this is called yarn bombing. When you bomb something, it's not a bad thing, it's just you blow it up. You blow it up with yarn, right? So there was no plan anywhere that said, you need to wrap everything in yarn, right? Nobody said that in a plan. But it's kind of fun, right? And if you saw it on the street, you'd say, oh, that's really interesting. DIY, yes. Tactical, no. So up to this point, we've researched in Latin America and Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. These are 4 free shared open source documents. You can get them on tacticalurbanismguide.com. And one of the things that we talk about in the guides and in the book is, what is the historical context? Because obviously this is not new. We've been designing cities and participating in cities for centuries, thousands of years, right? So what makes this moment in time so important that we realize that this is the way to go? The mega projects is not the way to go, right? So there's these 4 elements. The first, and this is more catered towards the United States, I think, than anywhere else, but I think you could see ties to other places. Our whole system of development in the United States is based on suburban sprawl. And in 2008, when we started our firm, that all came crashing down. And I already mentioned that at the beginning of my presentation. But this really impacted our business specifically because most of our clients are municipal clients. So when the recession hit, their budgets all dried up, which means our work dried up. So we saw it firsthand. Municipal governments don't have any money to do anything because they wasted the last 10 years doing all sorts of ridiculous things with their money. But you still had people living in places that needed municipal services, right? You pair that with our general cynicism and distrust in government. You look at our 2, presidential candidates here. They're really railing against and reacting to the same thing, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. It's like a distrust and a disconnect with government. There is a disconnect between the people who are governing and the people who are being governed. And at the same time, you have more people moving to urban places in the United States than ever before. I mean, this is a worldwide issue, but in the United States, we have a generation, the millennial generation, that wants to be in more urban contexts. Our driving habits have peaked. Our driving in the United States peaked in 2008. That is, we're driving as much today as we did in 1997. That's a big deal. I mean, for AutoNation, for the United States to say, you know what, our driving patterns have changed substantially, but our transportation networks still haven't caught up to this. So, the latest trend is that little blue line is actually on an uptick again. We're still at a low point, but without any other alternative, how else are people going to get around in the United States, right? And that brings me to more specifically our local planning process. How do we do planning in the United States? How do we make change happen? And usually, you go to a public meeting where you sit in an audience just like this and you hear somebody like me talk about whatever planning project it is, a new highway that we're going to build in the middle of your neighborhood. And there's no interactive process. It's not really that process is not meant for me to change my outcome. Usually I'm just checking a box somewhere that said you have to have public meetings. And I like to show this. This is the construction of the interstate, I-95 in the middle of downtown Miami. And it went through one of our first communities, which is a community of African Americans, and destroyed their community. And the only building that they could not demolish was the church, the Mount Zion Church, because it was the only place where there was a community of people that could fight against this thing. But we're still left with this, the remnants and the product of this process, which is not only it's reliant on mega projects, silver bullet type projects, that is the stadium that's going to solve everything in your neighborhood, or even the streetcar. There's a lot of 2-block long streetcars in the United States that are billed as the next best thing. And it's not results oriented. You're not really meant to impact the result of that public process. And finally, the fourth biggest element that really helped shape this idea for us now was the rise of digital technology, the rise of hacking culture. You think about the change from Windows 3.0 to wherever we are now, and we have come as a culture to expect that things change, right? The iterative nature of our world is such that every device that we have, we expect it to get better every time, right? Again, we do that with our devices, we do that with our software. Why aren't we doing that with our cities? We do these one-size-fits-all solutions for cities, and they just don't work for 90% of everything that we do. The silver lining is that access to digital infrastructure has changed the way that we interact with government. It doesn't have to be this, right? The only congregation that can save their building is the church. That's not the world that we live in anymore, right? We can just start up a website, and for all you know, that website represents thousands of people, but it was really just me, right, starting that website. That's how it is. You're not anywhere in this world unless you have a website. And you can really interact with your elected officials in a way that you could never before. When I started my career, you had to call your elected officials. It wasn't really, Facebooking or email. But as time went on, our elected officials, I found, became more accessible because I just direct message them, Facebook message. Hey, what do you think about this? And they're just very responsive. And I think that most people still don't know that. And it gets to that cynicism in government. They think that the government is something separate, but it's really closer than it's ever been before. So I want to talk about 3 different approaches or ways of applying tactical urbanism in the world today, because it's not just, as I said, citizens. It could be government. It could be some sort of middle nonprofit sector. So the first way you can apply this is just as unsanctioned citizen action. This is the guerrilla style, illegal at times, but not sanctioned by any sort of government agency. And I want to explain that concept against the backdrop of a case study of a trail and a greenway, a linear park in Miami called the Ludlam Trail. This is a 6-mile long, 100-foot wide former rail corridor. It was a freight rail corridor built by Henry Flagler, and it's one of the reasons why Miami exists is because of this rail line, okay? And it was discontinued for freight use in the mid-2000s and just sort of sat there empty. It wasn't used for transport, it wasn't used for anything, it was just empty land. And different government entities had planned for a light rail line, for a commuter rail line, and most recently for a trail. And the light rail lines, I have to tell you, were met with fierce opposition in the community. This is a single-family home neighborhood. Most people didn't want to see any trains in their backyard, even though they bought next to a rail line. But this is the idea that really resonated with people, was a greenway. And just so that you understand the context, that's a map that you can't really see of Dade County, but our county is one where over 45% of the people live on 15% of the land. It's a huge amount of density, and as a native Miamian, I grew up there, we started seeing Miami as a suburban rural place. It was very rural for most of my time. I went to school in New York, I came back, and it had changed dramatically, and especially over the past 10 years, it is a completely different place than when I grew up. And we have a lot more density and intensity of use than we ever did before. But what we lack is, we have a lot of people living in a small area, but we don't have any of the infrastructure that we need to service all these people. So you've got a lot of people living in close proximity. We don't have trails, we don't have protected bike lanes, we have one rail line. So we need a lot of big transportation to happen very fast. But of course, my experience has been the big transportation projects, the Robert Moses scale, it just doesn't work for us. It's not gonna happen. So how can we get to some sort of a better result soon? That's been my focus. And just so that my connection to the Ludlam Trail is that I live very close. See, this is my house right here. I bought this house because of the Ludlam Trail, because I knew that this was going to be my access to 5 schools, 2 major regional parks, our transit network. I mean, just having access to this one line opens up my world, and I don't have to drive around everywhere. But as you can see there, it's still a rail line, right? I mean, it's still an abandoned rail line. So, and the bigger picture is that this is Dade County. It forms a part of a greenway network that will, when it's complete, be, I think, a thing that really attracts people to Miami-Dade County. I mean, internationally, people will come to Miami because of this infrastructure. And we only have really 20% of it already built, but you can see it's growing. And part of my spare time, just a little plug, is a nonprofit that I'm chairman of called Green Mobility Network. So all of this work that you're about to see was not done professionally. It was done as a neighbor and as somebody in the community that knows how to organize people because of my design profession. So there again is that professional skill set coming to bear. If you have a project like this, don't wait for the government to take it on because they're just not going to. So we started with just the website I showed previously. And in my experience, if you start a website, all sorts of things happen because then people take you seriously. You're a legitimate force. Like I said, I could be 100,000 people behind that website or just one. But people always think that you're more, if you have a well-designed website. So have a well-designed website for your project. So, we had a lot of people come out of the woodwork just through the website, and we also did door-to-door knocking. But an interesting thing happened. At the beginning of this project, we started talking to the railroad company. Now, the land is not publicly owned. It's still owned by Florida East Coast Industries. And nobody had ever asked them what they wanted to do with their land. So the municipal government had planned, light rail and commuter rail, but nobody ever said, what do you guys want? So we started talking to them. And what happened was they said, well, that's great. We like greenways, but we're not going to do that right now. And we'll let you know what we're going to do. Months went by, and the neighbors got little postcards in the mail for saying that they were going to change the zoning, the comprehensive plan of that land, to allow for single-family homes. They were going to build condos and houses on that land. Of course, that didn't go over well with anybody, and they weren't going to have any public meetings. They were just going to let it go through a process, a semi-judicial legislative process, where the land was just approved. It was entitled at the end of that process. And we said, you have to talk to the neighbors. You have to ask what people want before you do this. I mean, it's your private property, but you also have to meet people halfway. They didn't do that, so what we did was, myself and another urban planning colleague, we organized a town hall meeting where we invited them to come out and give their part. And we had 500 people come out, and I'll tell you that was the most brutal 3 hours, not for me, for the railroad company, because now we're all friends, but they went up and they took it like champs. I mean, answered question after question, the same answer. Yes, we're going to be building houses here. Their solution for the trail was a 5-foot sidewalk. So this is, in and of itself, citizen action, because we didn't wait for anybody to tell us that we could host a public meeting. It was free. This is a high school that's on the trail. And the week after that was the town hall meeting where they were going to approve the plan. They did not approve the plan because we had all these 500 people go to that meeting and say, we don't want this. But it was a result of having organized at this point. So the result was that the county initiated a planning process that was top-down. It started bottom-up, and it became top-down, the most well-attended charrettes in county history. And now the result is there is going to be a little bit of development at certain key intersections. The trail will go through the buildings and over the intersections, but the majority of it will be a restored pine rockland. So what a difference a year makes. We went from November being in this contentious battle to a year later being kumbaya and 3 minutes, okay. So the second phase of this, the second aspect of this is as a demonstration project, because the day after these public meetings where the railroad was basically rejected, they called me and said, Tony, we have a problem. You have 500 of your people that just got up on the public record and said that they walk their dogs and they jog and they walk on this private property. It's a liability problem for us. We're going to have to put fences up at every single cross-section with barbed wire. And I said, haven't you learned anything? After what you just went through, you're going to try to take a step back. You need to open up the trail to public access so that people can see what an amazing piece of property you have, and we will lobby our state legislature to buy it from you and turn it into a greenway and a trail. So that conversation went on for months, and the way the railroad works is the CEO is basically very hands-on in everything. And he had never even been on the trail until August. And there he is on his first bike ride on the trail, and that coincided with the creation from our office of this pamphlet, just a few pages, as if we were doing a design project for school. And it was just a theoretical thing. Let's show them how they're going to do a temporary trail and show them all the cool events and the things that we can do on the trail once they have it open to address their liability concerns. And we gave that to them in August. He took that ride in August, and he had his aha moment. And within 1 month, they had spent $200,000 on a temporary trail. that removed the remaining railroad ties and berm and made a temporary trail. And since then, we've had monthly events on the trail, sometimes several times a month. People call me all the time. They want to do a walk. They want to do something. We can't open it publicly yet because we still have liability concerns, but this monthly event methodology has really helped. And it's a proof of concept. Now, there's no question we're going to get the money to buy this land, and we're going to make it into one of the best trails in Dade County. But it wouldn't have happened if we hadn't taken the lead on showing them, through our professional work, what it could be in the short term. And so we have museum exhibits, and this is the first bike ride. Part of it is having political buy-in. So everybody in that photo on the ends is a City of Miami commissioner, a Miami-Dade County commissioner, getting their buy-in. Now we have political champions. And you know, anything that we do in this world, it can start as a citizen-led project, but you need a political champion. So it's very important. Here it is Ludlam Lights. I'm going to fast forward to the end here because there's some, sorry. One thing that's important to know, we used this methodology to test out a master plan that we're working on in Burlington. And I think this is one of the most exciting parts of it, is being able to test practical things with the agencies that you're working with. I've only got 2 minutes, that's why I had to rush, sorry. So the fire department is often the biggest impediment to doing better bicycle infrastructure because they want wider roads. And the fire chief will kill our plans. It's not the mayor, it's not anybody else, it's the fire chief. So we said, Chief, why don't you bring your equipment out the day of, we'll do a demonstration project as part of our public input. Rather than have a simple meeting where we just come and give you a presentation and that's it, we go out and we actually enlist volunteers to build out the infrastructure that they want to see. To the point where we get data, you know, we collect data about how people feel on this infrastructure and how many people went out, and then document it. So this is a temporary bike lane. This wasn't there the day before and it wasn't there the day after, but it led to the plan's adoption and it led to more permanent changes over time. And there's no one that could tell you that that wasn't real. So my five lessons, okay, homework. Start with smaller budgets. Start with smaller steps, shorter steps. Limit your budget, you know, $100 or $1,000, don't go too crazy. Future ties, so create really high expectations about your project. Just because you're starting with small steps doesn't mean that you don't need that bigger vision, because people need the bigger vision to see where they're going, right? Look at existing plans and do not ask for permission. Asking for forgiveness is a lot easier, believe me. Thank you, everybody, I appreciate it.
You really have a way with words, Tony. Future ties, wow.
Well, you know, our business is all about creating a brand, really, and changing perceptions. And the language that we use is a big part of that.
I was really interested to see, given that a lot of our discussions today will be indeed about the role of the professional, as Martijn said. Okay, a temporary bike rail, we can go out and paint that at night, you and I. We can do that. But we cannot close Times Square off to traffic. You need leadership from someone who represents an institution, in this case, Mayor Bloomberg. So there's a tension between the scale of things that we as individuals can do without asking permission, but we also need leadership from the institutions. And how do we get the commissioner of Dade County to act like a Bloomberg?
Well, I mean, by having events and basically, elected officials just want to know that they're supported, right? So if you show them you have a constituency of people, basically you have to be your own non-elected official. You create a constituency of people around whatever it is that you're doing. It could be a bike lane, it could be a transit project, it could be anything, right? Once you have a group of people behind you, then you have a voice and you're taken seriously. But you have to also have public events and a venue for the elected official to be able to champion those things. So I think that having a champion is key, because you can only get to a certain point, and then your voice as a citizen, as you said, it can't take you the full way there. So you need to have those champions, but they come out of the woodwork. They always come out of the woodwork. They are there to start
if they know it's in their own interest.
Exactly. And a lot of these folks are not urban planners. They couldn't care less about the things that we care about. So it's just about getting reelected for them. I mean, it's cynical, but
no, it's not cynical.
Right.
It's important to know where their interest lies so that you can activate that. I really loved your picture of the angry driver. I come from Los Angeles myself, full of angry drivers,
Yeah, right.
especially when it comes to bike lanes. You said we have to get people committed to plans like this, and Ludlam Trail is a great example. How do you get this angry driver ever committed to a bike lane?
Well, you know, we say there's a good 40% of people that are simply don't care about bikes. And we don't...
They hate them.
They hate them. And we don't pander to them. We don't address them. They're the SUV drivers, the Humvee drivers. But we look at the 60% of people that we find in the United States that really want to drive, want to ride their bikes. They have an experience with it in the past, but they're interested but concerned, right? They don't want to ride in the middle of the street, right? And so that's the market that we look at when we talk about bicycling in particular. But we recognize that there's just going to be a percentage of the population that doesn't care about these things, and that's fine. We don't try to change their minds, actually.
Last question, quick question. You must have been absolutely crazy to start a firm in 2008.
We were crazy. We didn't really have a choice, right? The firm that I was working at, the business just dried up. And similarly for my business partner, so we were out on our own and we had a couple little projects and we said, we have the same philosophy, let's just get together and do it. And it's been it's been great since then. I mean, we must have been crazy, but there was no choice.
And then things happen.
And then things happen, right, exactly.
Tony Garcia, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.